on YouTube. There's a link to it on Blackboard, and I sent it to your email.
So this is directly after the subjective relativism? Okay.
Okay, next theory, conceptual relativism. Conceptual, think about these titles, okay? They give you a hint as to what they are, okay? Conceptual relativism. Here's the thesis, okay? The thesis, the main gist is societies can genuinely differ. Think about the words carefully. Societies can genuinely differ over moral worth of an action or practice. They can genuinely differ over the moral worth of an action or practice. Okay? So back to the fact-value debate stuff that we talked about in the video. Okay? Fact-value debate stuff. There is agreement on definitions, but disagreement as to what counts as right and wrong. What kind of disagreement do we have here? Fact or value?
Value.
A little bit. Okay, it's kind of a good question because it's not quite value, but it's definitely not fact. They agree on the definition. Okay? But they disagree as to what counts as right or wrong. Okay? They know like what wrongness and rightness is, and cultures agree, according to this theory. They agree that there is such a thing called rightness, and this is what it is. There is such a thing called wrongness, and this is what it is. But kind of like those check boxes we were just talking about earlier, the check boxes as to how you get into the category of right or wrong, cultures differ. Okay? The worth of the action differs according to the culture, the moral worth. Okay? So basically, according to this theory, there's no such thing as properties of rightness or goodness. There's categories, but not properties. Okay? Remember our discussion about properties in metaphysics? So a property is a characteristic that something can have, right? So this means that no like action or practice can have a characteristic of being right or wrong. It's not possible. Okay? There's no properties of rightness or wrongness. Okay? There's just a relation between an act and a particular society. So look, you've got murder, okay? Murder has no rightness or wrongness to it. Its only worth is what category the society puts it in. This is really close to cultural relativism. Okay, where cultures decide what's right and what's wrong. But you understand in this one, they're not saying that murder is wrong because there's no moral properties. Okay, they're not saying murder is wrong. They're saying murder belongs in the wrong category in our culture. But they're not saying anything about that particular act that makes it wrong. It's not intrinsically wrong. Does that make sense?
No.
No? Okay, so let's take a positive one, like generosity. Okay, there's nothing, according to this theory, there's nothing about generosity. Okay, there's nothing about kindness or, stopping to fix an old lady's flat tire on the side of the road. Okay, there's nothing about that makes it good, except that it's on the list of things that go in the good category in the United States. That's it. That's the only value it has. Okay, there's no goodness. It's just like here's a box with the word good on it, and we put it in that box to separate it from these, but there's no intrinsic value to it. It's not like people that do that become good people and we like them and trust them and stuff. Okay, there's no moral value. There's just lists and categories, and they just sort them out, and the culture decides that.
So people do not become good people when they do.
They can't because there are no properties, right? So you can't there's no rightness or wrongness. You can't really, that would be an extension of that. You can't really have good people because good would be a property of a person, right?
So there's not good people or bad people. There's just
people
doing things.
Doing things. That's right.
Cultures and ethnicity.
Yeah. Do you see how this differs from cultural relativism, though? Because cultural relativism literally says murder is wrong. There's something about that makes it wrong. Okay? Stopping on the side of the road to help an old lady with her flat tire is right. It's good. That's a good thing. Okay? It has this texture of goodness to it, right? Has this ingredient of goodness to it. That's what and that's assigned by culture. That's what cultural relativism says. But conceptual relativism says, they're not really, they're just good in concept. They're not really good. Okay, it just belongs to this concept, this box, this category, this list. That's all. Yeah, and pretty random because it's just up to the culture.
Imagine if those were opposite.
What the theory said, what you can be, right? Just there's nothing that says it can't. That's what this theory doesn't say is exactly how cultures, like the criteria that cultures use to sort out those lists. It just says that they do, which kind of makes it less prescriptive and more descriptive, right? Okay, describing things rather than prescribing things, recommending action. It doesn't do that. It doesn't really recommend any action. It doesn't tell you how to live. It just says this is the way things are. That's a sign of a not good ethical theory because it's just saying.
Most of our society falls in a lot of these non-good categories.
I know, it's scary, isn't it? I wonder how we're not all dead multiple times. Okay. So let's evaluate it. It is more radical than normative relativism because it says that moral properties don't exist at all. Okay, so it's crazier than normative relativism. It is impossible under this, because there's no moral properties, it's impossible under this theory to actually have a moral difference. What does that even mean when you don't have moral properties, right? How can you disagree with somebody? Like, there's nothing there to disagree about, right? There's just nothing, okay? So this leads to this weird thing that I put down there. Basically, this is how we would have to talk. Murder to us is right to us versus murder to you is wrong to you, right? There's so many definitions and it's so individualized, like it's just craziness. It's craziness. Okay, conceptual relativism. It's not a great theory. Ethical skepticism. For those, this is maybe where some of you are at by now after going through some of these theories. You're like, I don't know, and who cares? Okay, this is the theory for you. Here it is. This one says, nobody's views are true. Nobody's views are true. There is no true theory. There is no good theory. Even, let's just say, but even if they are, okay, let's just say, for sake of argument, that there could be a true theory. Even if there was, we couldn't know what it is, so it doesn't really matter anyway. Okay? Skeptics. Either don't know or can't know. Okay? Epistemological, in an epistemological sense, there could be kind of two different, like you got epistemological and ontological there. Epistemology, right, has to do with knowledge. Ontology has to do with being or existence, okay? So in an epistemological sense, ethical skeptics say moral truths are there, we just can't know what they are. So they can't really be a guiding force in our life, because even if they were there, so why are we arguing about it? Because we can't know if they're true or not anyway, so who cares? Okay? Ontologically though, these are even stricter ethical skeptics, okay? And they actually go beyond that and say, no, they're not there at all. They don't exist at all. Moral truths don't exist at all, okay? Normative relativists and physical naturalists, this is where you're at. This is your home base, your sweet spot right here, okay? If you're a physical naturalist, remember, non-physical things don't exist. The only reality are things that can be measured by the hard sciences, and that does not include moral truths. So if you're a physical naturalist, you are, by default, if you're going to remain true to your worldview, then you should be an ethical skeptic. Okay? Specifically in the ontological crowd. Okay? And you would hold that moral truths don't exist at all. All right? Which is possible. I mean, some people are like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. But think about the difference between moral truth and moral value. Okay? They don't necessarily deny the existence of moral value to certain actions. They just say that moral truths don't exist. Okay? And value they would probably assign based on the effects of the action, right? So if the action had positive effects, right, created further progress or like created a better situation for survival or something like that, then they would assign a value of good to it. Okay, so they don't deny that moral value exists, but they do deny that moral truth exists.
Murder is forever bad.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, like any kind of normative standard. Yeah. Okay, so let's evaluate this briefly. It does seem to be the case that moral truths do exist. I mean, when you just think about it, like murder is wrong, murder is bad, okay? Not just murder is bad, but murder is wrong. And again, by murder we mean killing another human for no good reason. Now we can disagree on whether or not that's a good reason, right? And cultures do. Okay, some cultures say child sacrifice is a good reason to kill a human. And some cultures don't. Most cultures don't. Okay? So we can disagree on the good reason, but all cultures agree that killing a human for no reason, right, is wrong.
How do you decide to kill someone?
You just get bored.
Well, that would be a reason.
This is scaring me a little bit. The fact that you know how to do that. I don't know, you get bored. It happened to me the other day.
Maybe you're just curious.
Yeah,
It's like I wonder what that feel like to take another person's life.
If I was bored, did that action.
Why?
And then I would.
She just said she gets a good rush out of it. Okay. Okay, here's the other evaluation on this theory. This theory is not a great theory because it can't recommend moral behavior at all. Because we don't know what to do, right? Or even if it exists at all. There is, right? I don't know.
Wouldn't it be based on moral values?
Well, it doesn't really make any claims about moral value. It just says that there are no moral truths. And by doing that, it kind of throws the baby out with the bathwater, because when you say that, you can't recommend any action. I mean, maybe it could recommend action and say, okay, there's no moral truths, so you ought to perform the actions that have the highest moral value in your culture. But that's cultural relativism, right? We've already discussed that theory. Does that make sense? So it can't say anything else without repeating what a theory has already said. So this theory by itself, right, contained by itself, says no one's views are true, even if they are true. We can't know them. So it's just as good as saying no one's views are true. You get the same result, okay? But if you say no one's views are true, or we can't know whether anybody's views are true, then you also can't recommend any action. And it becomes a poor ethical theory, okay? Maybe it could have some value in epistemology, but as far as ethics are concerned, it's very unhelpful, okay? It tells us, it informs us a little bit more about possibilities of how we might think about ethics, but not how we might act. Is that, are you tracking?
Sounds like the guy that made this theory up with bad attitude at the back of the room.
Yep.
At the end of the 4-hour discussion.
Yep. Okay, here's the another weird part. Do I talk about this after? Almost. Okay. It can't recommend behavior, but this includes two things that skeptics often want to include. What are you doing? Kim, just do what you got to do. You know. Okay. We will assign good moral value to whatever you decide to do. Okay, including the view of skepticism itself. Right? It can't even recommend itself. It's kind of like relativism that way. We can't know how to think, how to behave, how to act. We can't even know if this attitude is right. Right?
So it's the theory is skeptic about the theory itself.
Ad nauseum. Yes.
How you decide if it's right or wrong without knowing?
You can't.
So you just like
your feet in this with this theory. Yep. You're basically paralyzed, right? With this theory, your feet are firmly planted in midair.
Oh yeah.
Like right? If this gives you this kind of feeling, okay, then you're in the right spot. Skeptics are generally not happy people. Okay, they're not. Also, the other thing it can't recommend to you, it can't even recommend that you be tolerant. Because who knows if that's right? You're not. Right? You can't even be tolerant under this view. Because some people are like, we don't know, so let's just be tolerant of everybody's views. But skepticism can't recommend that because it doesn't even know if that's right. It's bad.
So there's a good and bad way to be, but
we don't know what it is.
Good and bad, so there's really no way to be at all. So you're kind of just there.
So at this point, if you're like in the corner, like in the fetal position, rocking back and forth, right? That's basically the only thing you're left with, and even then you just gotta block it out.
Even then you're just like, why am I doing this?
Right.
I don't know what I don't know.
As a catalyst? I never know why.
I would use it as a catalyst to try to figure out other types of morals.
Yeah, kind of like a Descartes type scenario, right, where you wipe everything out and start with.
Comparison.
Yeah, it might hold some value that way.
This theory could almost be true.
We're Descartes. We compare everything.
It's so close that it's really far away. It looks like it's ahead, but it's actually a lap
They're saying that
behind.
there's nothing that's for certain. Like you can't say one action is good or bad. That if they would just say that it depends on why you did it, then it would be so true.
Okay, we're getting there.
Well, this is the morality of an individual.
I guess changing an old
Instead of
lady's
just
tire
a
good,
cultural thing
or
or
you're doing
something
it for
made
money.
by like, religion, like the religion worldview, or any kind of lawmakers. This is literally the moral of the individual person as a whole.
Except that it's anti-moral because there's nothing. It's a vacuum. There's nothing there.
Yeah, so they have like half a good system that just says screw it.
So then here's the deal. If you like the theory, right, in all seriousness, if you're like, well, it's got some structure to it, which it kind of does, but then it like guts itself, right? So it kind of has some, but then if you're going to say this, if you're going to go by this theory, you're going to have to say, I hold to the theory that holds that who knows about theories, which doesn't make you sound real sharp.
So the last two bullet points, we're going in the right direction.
Okay, yeah, dang it. Okay, combinatorial relativism is what it sounds like. Combinatorial. It sounds like a political party or something, right? But it's not. It's a combination of absolutism or universalism and relativism. Okay, this is the one for all you people that are like peacemakers and want everybody to be happy. If you think about Kant, right, it was like, why are we all arguing? It's in the middle, like y'all come together. Okay, this is kind of like that. They recognize, people who hold to this recognize the badness of relativism, the weaknesses, but then they also recognize they're uncomfortable with a universal standard, so they try to be friends. Okay, they try to make them be friends, and this is what happens. Okay, so you're combining absolutism or universalism, they're basically the same thing, and relativism. Okay, so what we need is I need to teach you what a material principle is and a formal principle is, because that's what we're combining. Okay, so here's formal and material principles. Okay, for a second I thought we'd only been going for 15 minutes, and I was like, no way, that's awesome, but we haven't. Okay, for 40 minutes. So a formal principle states necessary conditions, a material principle states sufficient conditions. It'll get easier as we keep going. Formal principle gives the structure, material principle gives the content. Formal principle is the mold, material principle is the plaster that goes inside the mold. Okay? So, here's an example. The idea of justice. Okay? Here's the mold, not you, and not my son, but the idea of justice, okay? Idea of justice. Here's the idea. Equals should be treated equally. Okay? That's a concept, right? The concept of justice, and if you were to, flesh it out, it's equals should be treated equally. Okay? That's the concept. But that's the formal principle. Think formal, form. Okay? Creates a form. All right? Anybody ever work with concrete? I know a ridiculous amount about concrete because my dad worked with concrete. So you build forms, right, before you pour. Okay? That's kind of this way. So you pour form, or you build forms in a certain shape, right? And then you pour the stuff inside. Okay? So the form is going to be the formal principle, the idea of it, but then the material is the stuff that goes inside. Okay? So for justice then, equals should be treated equally. Just generally that's a concept, okay? But then this is how we get that done. Look, Marxism, libertarianism, and utilitarianism all have different ways of applying that idea of equals should be treated equally. Okay? They all agree that justice is good and that justice means equals should be treated equally. But exactly what that means in practice differs between all three of these. Does that make sense? Okay? So what combinatorial relativism tries to do is take some sort of absolute form, but then leave it open for other cultures or individuals or whatever to fill it with whatever they want. Okay? You kind of at least have the general idea? Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so it takes a formal principle, combines it with a material principle. So it takes a moral absolute, right? It tries to take something as a mold and says this is a moral absolute. But then it says, but how you apply that, how you define it, what you do with that, how necessary you make it, how strict you make it, or whatever, all that's up to you. Here's the concept, and you do what you want with it. So you see that here's the absolute, here's the relative part. You see that? Okay? So here's some examples. These are absolute principles. Okay? These are the forms, the mold. Okay, the formal principle, we ought to respect creatures with biographical lives. We ought to respect creatures with biographical lives.
What's biographical?
What's bio?
I know what biological is, but not biographical.
What's a biography? The story of
about a person,
somebody's life.
Yeah, okay.
Right? So a biographical life means there's a narrative there. Think of the phrase continuing self. Okay? Same idea.
Life with like a story behind it.
Yeah, a life that, right, okay, like an ant, okay, a tick doesn't really have a biographical life.
Yeah.
Okay? Dogs
mine.
have more of a biographical life. Do you see the difference between the two? Okay. So we ought to respect creatures with biographical lives. But you've introduced the whole problem. What does a biographical life mean? How do we respect creatures? What does it mean to respect? What is a creature? Okay? All of that stuff is left up to the culture or the person or whatever. You see how that makes it real relative real quick, right? So we could all kind of agree, right? All cultures maybe, let's just say, could agree that we ought to respect creatures with biographical lives. But that could look totally different depending on what culture you're in. I mean, think about that, right? This is the fact value thing again. We have the same value, but the facts are completely different. Okay? Think about the Eskimos, right? We both have the same formal principle of you ought to respect your elders. But what that looks like is completely different in our cultures, right?
That's a scary statement of religion.
So combinatorial relativism is trying to do that. It's trying to create some sense of order, some sense of accountability, some sense of understanding between us, right? Because it seems like some things are just wrong and some things are just right. So it tries to capitalize on that, but it's uncomfortable with applying that to everybody. And so it says, okay, do your thing inside of that. Just stick to these general rules. Okay, you see that? Okay. We have a duty to pursue the good life. We have a duty to pursue the good life. We have a duty not to harm others. I mean, we could all go, yeah, that's good. Everybody agrees to that. But think about it. We have a duty not to harm others. Do you know how many different definitions of harm there are? And how a lot of them, not harming, looks a lot like harming to us. But according to this, all of that would be good because they're following the moral, the formal principle. It's relativism in a fancy package. Okay? That's why it's called combinatorial relativism. Because ultimately, it's still left up to the individual, the culture, etc. Okay? So there's not enough content there. There's formal principles, but there's not enough content there to really recommend any action or behavior. The only thing it does recommend is that you take that and run with it. Do what you do. But that's a little bit scary because then it could look like anything, and people could say, well, that's just, I mean, yeah, you might kind of balk against the idea of beating your wife, but that's what we define as respect, and so we're still following the formal principle, right? So now, look, now what we have is beating your wife is okay and not beating your wife is okay. Beating your wife is good, not beating your wife is good. It's still relativism. See that?
Ideas.
Yeah, contradictory ideas can't both be true at the same time and in the same sense. Okay. Oh, dang it, man. Well, how many we got? We got Monday and Wednesday after this? Yeah. Two, three. Yeah. Yeah, we can,
Yeah,
let's
we
stop
can.
there. Let's stop there. We can do that. Hey, there'll be another reading assigned over the weekend, okay?
Okay.
You guys are almost done. We got this. Woo! Get close.